Can you hear me? I'm not used to having to talk into a microphone like this. I feel like I want to stand up. So, how many people are attorneys in the audience? Good. The topic says cyber law, but that's actually not what I'm going to talk about unless you came here to hear that. I can switch my topic. Anyone need to hear about law? Okay, good. Because what I'm actually talking about is research I did while I was still in law school. Even though I look pretty old, I went to law school after I retired from the Department of Defense as a senior executive at Cyber Command. And I did research for the Institute for Defense Analysis. The customer was Cyber Command. The question was, what should our strategy be for cyber warfare, cyber conflict? And I sat down with the previous deputy commander, and he asked, I have to make decisions as to putting resources towards defense, offense. How do I make those decisions? And it's such a new, fluid area, I need help. So Ida put me to work on looking at those questions, and here are the results, which I'll cut to the chase. You're not going to get an answer. It's more of a helping to shape the dialogue and the discussion. So what is strategy? Anybody here gone to war college? They teach you strategy is ends, ways, and means, and how to balance them. It's like a three-legged stool. If you don't have the balance, your strategy's going to fail. And I'll use this example here of World War I. The Germans thought they had a great strategy to win World War I. They were going to, their ends, which is their objective, is to take out France first and then Russia. Their ways of doing it was to quickly mobilize their forces, push through the Low Countries, and overwhelm the defenses. And their means of doing it was their army, essentially, and their industrial infrastructure and their railroads. The problem is, as you know, it didn't work. And as a result of this failed strategy, we had one of the most horrific wars in history, millions of deaths, casualties. What the lesson is that you have the wrong strategy. You could be going down up the river without a paddle. So it's very important in cyber conflict that we have the right strategy. It's up till the last 20, 30 years, the United States has relied mostly on advanced technology and superior resources to win wars. They haven't put too much effort into developing their strategy in the campaign because we haven't had to. That's not the case in cyber war. We don't have the same advantages we have in ground combat, air combat. So we really need to think more about our strategy. So in thinking about the strategy, we first need to understand the problem. So how do we think about the problem? Well, we think about the problem within our organizations, and we call them cylinders of excellence as opposed to stovepipes. But the truth is there's some of each. And we are organized within these different components, the Department of Defense, the law enforcement, the intel community. And that's the way we think of the problem. That's how we have authorities to deal with our problems. Unfortunately, the enemy doesn't organize that way. They don't think of the problem that way. They're an amorphous blob that can go anywhere they need to, attack, use any technique they need to achieve their objective. And we are, within these cylinders, trying to respond to that. Furthermore, on the graph, the cylinders look about the same, but you all know they're not. That DoD block is, what is it, $600 billion now? Which is 10 times the size of the next biggest block. So the resources are vastly unequal. And what happens is, as a former DoD guy and a former DHS guy and a former OD&I IC guy, the DoD ends up trying to fill the vacuum, fill the gaps and do other people's jobs for them. And this is where the politically incorrect part comes in. That's what I've been seeing when I was at Cyber Command, at other parts of the government. In the absence of a capable partner, Cyber Command DoD tries to do other people's jobs for them and not necessarily doing it optimally. So the question becomes, as Clausewitz pointed out, in order to win our war, the first thing you've got to do is realize what kind of war you're fighting. So are we fighting a war where military forces are engaged on the battlefield? Not in cyberspace, not so much. Are we fighting a battle of surveillance and reconnaissance? To some degree, yes. Huge incidences of Chinese data theft. Law enforcement. Most cyber incidents today are law enforcement issues. Currently, the threat globally of cyber theft is $400 billion a year. It ranks, I think, second to piracy as a global concern. So on a daily basis, it may seem very important for us to fight cyber wars, but it's truly more important to do cyber law enforcement and cyber counter-espionage, neither of which are traditional DoD missions. Then you have Homeland Security. And finally, regulation. Even more so than law enforcement, most of what we're facing is regulation. Every person who gets on a computer loads up their software, loads up their antivirus program. They're not regulated in any way. As opposed to if you get on a car, get in a highway, you have to have a driver's license. Your car has to be registered. So when people talk about regulation for cyberspace, the industry gets their bristles up. No way, we won't be regulated. You're stifling our creativity. Well, they may have said that in 1900 about automobiles too, but enough people got killed and had collisions at the intersection that they realized the government has to start regulating the use of automobiles. So as cyberspace becomes more critical to our daily life, there's going to have to be more regulation. And when we talk about cyber conflict, we need to talk about addressing all these aspects. So I heard in the last speaker talk about a cyber service. Good idea. But maybe we got to think even further. Maybe we need an organization that's not even in the Department of Defense. Something like a cyber Coast Guard, but not Coast Guard, Cyber Guard. They're the they were in Department of Transportation. Now they're in Department of Homeland Security during peacetime. They chop to the military during wartime. They have regulatory roles. They have law enforcement roles. Things like regulatory in terms of fisheries and things like that. They have rescue, search and rescue. These are the type of things we need to be thinking about in cyberspace, not just killing people and breaking things and counteracting enemy attacks. Here's another organization. Guy looks like a Navy officer, but anybody who's old enough knows that's the former Surgeon General. Uniform Public Health Service, not part of DoD. About 5,000 uniformed officers who work in different parts of the federal government to provide public health services. Maybe we need a model like that. A cadre of cyber officers that are not part of the DoD, but are trained experts and are deployed in different parts of the federal government to maximize our capabilities for cyber conflict. Last example is the Merchant Marine, which today is really non-existent other than the Merchant Marine Academy, which trains people. They get a commission. Some of them go into the Navy. Some of them go into the reserves. Most of them go into the commercial mariner fleet, but they still have a reserve duty commitment. During World War II, though, it was a huge operation to help mobilize the civilian fleet infrastructure to get resources to the European theater. So this is another model nobody thinks about today, nobody talks about it, but maybe we need a cyber academy that trains the best and brightest of our cyber people, and then they go off to work for Google and Microsoft, but they have a reserve commitment to get pulled in when we need them for national emergency. So why do I give you these examples? Well, because the old classic adage, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So we've got a $600 billion hammer right now. So what do we want to do? We want to use the DoD. Not necessarily the right answer. So now I'm going to, by the way, due to the format, I like to take questions while I'm talking, but due to the format, I'll wait till the end because I can't hear you if you ask a question anyway. But I'm going to transition because everything I told you was basically telling the Deputy Commander of Cybercom, those questions you asked me, you're asking the wrong question, and really you need to give this mission, most of this mission, to somebody else. So that was what I thought the answer was, but I had to also answer his question. So in answering his question, yes, there is a role for the military, for uniformed military in cyber conflict. Let's talk about what that role is. And that role is, just like the military role in any for other things, is to fight other militaries and achieve objectives given to them by the political leadership. So if we're going to do that, then we need to know how to do it and how to do it the best way. And the previous speaker had some good charts that were better than mine, but it talked about the fact that as tanks and armor developed, it took time to figure out the best strategy. Do you spread them out? Do you centralize them? Same questions. Is it best to attack one-on-one? I mean, just look, even basketball. Do you do a one-on-one? Do you do a zone defense? Do you mass your forces to attack his weaknesses? Or how do you best utilize your forces? These are questions that took decades to figure out the answer for air power and centuries to figure out the answer for ground combat. Ground combat, everyone knows 3-to-1. You need a 3-to-1 advantage to defeat, for attack, offense to defense. Does that apply in cyberspace? Who knows? Other things, specific techniques. When the airplane first came out, people had to figure out how to make a U-turn and get behind the enemy to shoot him. They came up with this Immelman technique, named after the guy who invented it. What's the equivalent of the Immelman? What's the equivalent of the Crazy Ivan in naval warfare? These are things that need to be developed. And how do we develop them? With exercises, training, war games, simulations. So in answering the Deputy Commander's question, how should he posture his forces, defense or offense? What I'm saying is he needs to take forces off the front line and put them into training and exercises. We had the benefit of decades of going to the National Training Range before Operation Desert Storm. We perfected techniques post-Vietnam. We don't have that time frame now. We're engaged on a daily basis. But going back to my earlier discussion, what we're engaged in is not really cyber warfare. It's the shiny object. It's cyber espionage. It's cyber law enforcement. It's things like hacking the elections. These are not DoD missions. DoD, get back to basics. Go back to wargaming exercises, simulations. Figure out when you do face a peer competitor, how are you going to beat them? Because we don't have the answers right now, as far as I'm concerned. So, going back to the beginning, why is this important? Well, we right now, we're King Kong. We dominate the globe militarily, economically, politically. It may not stay that way forever. And look at things that happened in the past, groups that pop out of nowhere. And cyberspace is a ripe environment for strategic surprise. And when we're Goliath, we need to be worried about the cyber David, because it could be the chink in our armor. So that's why we need to invest and think more about cyber strategy. So I don't know how much time I have, if I'm over. All right, so any questions? Halfway through. We have time for questions. Yes.
It seems that a lot of what you're talking about would have been like kind of a joint level or a national focus. Very different inside of a service capability, right? You have worked with U.S. Cyber Command and also at our cyber service level. So a lot of what you were describing sounds like a joint focus. Like, any thoughts on what the service fight looks like in cyberspace?
The question is, what about at the below the joint headquarters level, the service component level and below? And what does the fight look like there? And you're absolutely right. Most of this presentation is looking up from the combatant command and up to the national level. The latter part, though, does address, and I think you could use a study like this, and it was published by IDA as well as in the Cyber MCPA magazine. So hopefully you can get some traction. You could use something like this to go to your commander and say, we've got to turn down, push back on headquarters when they tell us, figure out what to do about Chinese cyber espionage. Instead, we need to focus on figuring out what are we going to do when we have a platoon or a battalion engaged in combat, in contact with an enemy, and how are we going to collapse the enemy's network and protect our network while we're engaged. Just like you would never consider going into combat without sufficient air defense at the tactical level. You better not go into combat without sufficient network defense. And just like nowadays, they have drones that they're ready to launch at the tactical level. They better have some type of capability that if they're engaged at the tactical level to fight other military forces. Don't worry about the electric power grid. Don't worry about the national infrastructure of your opponents in force. Instead, worry about it's actually going to be harder targets. How are you going to get into the armored vehicle of your opponent? And it's going to be thankless work. So it's much easier to chase the sexy, shiny object. But that's not what the military component should be doing. And it's hard to say no, but maybe you can use research like this. I call it research, but analysis like this, endorsed by Institute for Defense Analysis, to try and say, hey, if we don't have our mission ready, we're going to suffer when the balloon goes up. Right now, we're lucky. I mean, the question is, how long will this period of good luck last? And I've been in the cyber world since '95, and I've been saying since then we're going to see something catastrophic, and we have not seen it. And even when I say catastrophic, I don't mean electronic Pearl Harbor. I've looked for cyber casualties, and I have not found them. When cyber kills someone, then you'll get more attention. Right now, we don't say this person was killed by a cyber attack. So as much money as we say is lost, it's not getting the attention. But a single life will get some attention. Not that I'm saying it's a good thing, it's a terrible thing. But does that answer your question?
It does. Some of what we found in the Army is that we struggle because we haven't had capability. Now, as we're starting to have more capability at the service level, the joint level got healthy first, right? And so now we've got doing a certain level of operation at the joint level. And now, as we're developing service capability, we're starting to figure out what that looks like for the land fight.
So it's interesting because, as going back to the strategy, the capability is the means. You've got to know what you're going to do before you get the means to do it. So I would argue that there's still some dialogue that needs to take place in this developing strategy, what do we need these forces for? As opposed to, well, everybody wants a cyber force. The Air Force has one, the Navy, well, we need one too. So that's essentially what I saw happen is, and some shell games where they said, okay, we're now going to call this cyber. It's been something else up till now, but now it's cyber because we want to have a capability. But yes, the capability needs to be developed. All right, but still, any questions or comments?